This presentation by Mr. Jeremy Kichler from University of Georgia will cover some of the following ideas for stretching your hay supply in both the presentation as well as in the question and answer session at the end of the presentation.
Okay, well, I'm Jeremy Kichler. I'm the county extension agent in Colquitt County, Moultrie, Georgia. Basically, we're in drought right now. We're going to talk about hay storage, feeding, forage sampling, and at the end, maybe some strategies to, kind of get through this drought. We're struggling right now. Winter grazing's off. Last week, about 40% of the state is not in drought, but that means 60% of this state, of Georgia, is suffering anywhere from, abnormally dry to extreme weather. So especially in North Georgia, hopefully we'll have better conditions here, coming up soon. Going into winter dry, that impacts surface water irrigation. We need to replenish some of these aquifers, for this coming up spring. So, more rain, the better, hopefully. If you look at, the rain outlook for the next 3 months, Georgia and the Southeast is forecasted to be above normal, which is good. So that means that hopefully we will, replenish some of these surface water supplies and aquifers. That's good for, forages, and hopefully we can get some winter grazing going. Of course, it's getting late for that. All right, so I've been getting this question quite a bit, and I stole this slide from the forage specialist from Clemson. Beginning in November, I was getting questions about, hey, how late is it to plant cool season forages? How late can I plant my ryegrass and oats and stuff like that? So rule of thumb, once you get past mid-November, yield losses can range from 20 to 50%, depending on forage species, weather, location, and stuff like that. So once we get into December, your winter annuals like rye, some of your early maturing species, early maturing winter annuals, you're probably going to be on the upper side of losses. So, but we really need to get, what impacts yield is, we want these winter forages to be established before it gets cold, or if it gets cold. I kind of wonder that sometimes, but, we want it to be tillering, because when we go into some of these, these winter annuals don't really grow, when it gets really cold, such as in January and February. So if you got winter grazing, feel good, because there's a lot of people out there that hadn't had the chance to establish these winter annual forages. If you happen to have some pastures of graze or winter annual grazing, they looked at 2 different grazing systems: a continuous grazing, which is probably the most common that we have here in Georgia, where people just let the cows out and let them graze, or rotational grazing, or more of an intensive grazing system. And they looked at, all right, how many cow can we reduce the pounds of hay that we feed per cow by going from a continuous to a rotational grazing? So after the 3-year average, they reduced hay feeding by about a third. That can save you $35, $40 per cow per season, just by implementing, a more rotational grazing type of system. So if you look at grazing systems, continuous stocking, 30, 40% efficiency. But the more that we manage, the more that we use a rotational grazing system, we can increase the efficiency of how those animals utilize forage. So strip grazing is something that I'm seeing more of. Basically, you put up an electric fence or a temporary fence in front of the cows and just give them, 1 or 2 days of grazing. Once they utilize that, you shift that grazing over, or the electric fence over. So that's a pretty efficient way of just a simple strip grazing type of production system. Every year, it's estimated that $3 billion of hay is lost year in the United States due to storage and feeding losses. So that is something that's kind of crazy. But, smaller producers can't really afford these big hay barns and stuff like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the better ways to reduce some of these storage and feeding losses. You can get 10 to 20% losses from field curing, curing in the field. You can get another 10% from harvest losses. But look at the storage losses and feeding losses, it can average 30-40% for storage and 20 to 30% for feeding. And those are the type of steps that we can probably lower just by doing some simple stuff. So it's not really unusual to see losses greater than 70% in hay production. So when you store hay outside, this is pretty common in some areas where we store it outside because that's the only way we can afford to store hay. But the bigger the roll, we kind of underestimate how much loss we have from weathering losses. So in this particular example here, 14 inches, it's measured 14 inches from the outer end to the center. That's 74% of the volume there that you're losing dry matter, that you're losing forage quality in. So every pound of dry matter is expensive, and we just got to figure out a way to reduce those losses, because at the end of the day, we have to be sustainable. Try to save, try to save every pound of dry matter we can and feed it to that cow. So this is from the Forage Crop Pocket Guide. This is something from the Southern Forages book. I use this thing all the time. It shows the percent losses on the y-axis, 0 to 50%. But it kind of shows you based off bale diameter, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 feet bale diameters. It shows you, for example, if you have an average full depth of 4 inches, which is shown on the bottom, and you have a 3-foot bale diameter, that's 40% of your bale that's lost due to spoilage and storage losses. So feeding losses, if you unrolled your hay and compared it to feeding it in a ring, the percent waste on the first day, would be about 12.5% if you just unrolled it on the ground. And you can reduce those losses just by using the basic hay ring, reduce it to 5%. When they reevaluated this 7 days later, the cows trampled it. We had, about half, about 50% or 40 to 50% loss in the unrolled production system. But, that hay ring saved us a lot of hay there. And there are differences in what kind of hay ring or what kind of feeding structure that we have. So they were comparing, feeding losses using a cone, a ring, a trailer. We use a lot of trailers around here, and also a cradle type of feeder. The most efficient one was the cone feeder, which is shown at the top of the slide here, 2 to 5%. The ring reduced losses a lot, maybe a little bit, more losses, in the ring feeder, but nothing compared to the trailer or the cradle feeder. So just some basic things that you can do to reduce, losses on your farm. And hopefully that good quality hay can make it to the cow. Here's a really, really good cost comparison. So, if you're using small bales, about 50 pounds, this example here showed you how much you can save by how you feed the hay. So both of these, we fed small bales on the ground, and we also fed it in a feeder. So in this example here, we figured 40 bales was the amount needed for a cow for 90 days. So since they were both, the storage losses are the same, 5%, because, they were in a barn or, in a protective environment. So storage losses are kept constant. But look at the feeding losses. So when they were fed on the ground, we lost about a quarter of it. So that increased our total bales to 52. Now, if we fed it in the feeder, we reduced, feeding losses from 25 to 5%. There was a significant savings there in this particular example. What about large bales? 850-pound bales on a dry matter basis. This time the example is a little bit different in where, we fed it on the ground, fed it in a feeder, which is the same. But when we fed it on the ground, we basically took it out. We stored them outside. So storage losses were 25%, and then you lost another 35%. So we can save some money by, just, putting it in a feeder if you can. Now, I get questions about twine or net wrap. So this is some of the typical hay losses. If you put it in a hay barn or a hoop house or just cover it up with a plastic wrap. But if you look at the bottom of this slide, the outside on the ground, there are some differences between what type of wrap or if you use twine, if you stack it outside on a well-drained soil, 20 to 40%, but if you use net wrap, you can potentially reduce some losses there. So, what type of wrap or what type of twine you use can also impact storage losses when you do it outside. This is the same thing, looking at different ways of feeding hay. So the moral of the story is try to use a hay ring if you can. So I thought this was really interesting, looking at how moisture is distributed, when bales are stored on the ground. So in this particular example, red means it's dry, blue means there's more moisture, dark blue means, 40% moisture. So if you look at twine wrap versus net, there was some differences in how much moisture was getting into the bale just by, using net wrap compared to twine. Also in that study, they looked at, all right, what if I put the twine on a pallet, and it made a big difference too. So on the right-hand side, that same bale that was wrapped with twine on a pallet, reduced the spoilage of that particular bale when it was elevated up. We do a lot of peanut hay, and I'm seeing more and more of this B-wrap. It's expensive. It can reduce dry matter losses quite a bit compared to the twine or some of this other type of wrap here. So I think you have to make some modifications to the baler, but there may be something to consider. So if you store your field outside, which is probably the most common way of storing hay, here are some recommendations. Store it on a high, well-drained ground. Store it in a sunny area. I know what people are doing, but I see a lot of hay stored outside around field edges underneath trees. And, you got to do it because you don't want to store all your hay on the hay field, but that's probably, not a good thing to do. All right. When you put up hay and store it outside, store in rows with the flat edges touching and with the round edges separated. Orient the rows, north and south, and go down the slope instead of across the slope. That catches water too. I've done a lot of hay sampling this past fall, and for $20, you can get a lot of information. I think the university, we do NIR sampling, which is cheaper and quicker. But if you want to, call your county agent, but you want to sample each field separately and also each cutting. So we usually call each field and each cutting a lot of hay. Try to get 20 cores from 20, try to get at least a half a pound of hay or half a pound of sample from about 20 bales per lot. Also, too, I like to use a star probe because, you can sharpen the tips. Some of these Pennsylvania tubes or Pennsylvania, samplers, you can't really sharpen the tip and they get dull pretty quickly. So, all right, so fill it up a quart-sized bag, half a pound of forage, label it, and take it to your county office, your extension office. They'll send it to the UGA Feed and Forage Lab. If you want to go a private lab, Waters, Cumberland Valley, Dairy One, they're all great labs. And they'll give you a lot of good information that you can hopefully use to, figure out how to supplement. So here's a good illustration on how to, sample round bales. A lot of people, do, grab samples and stuff. If you use a probe and do it on the round side, basically you can get more. That sample will represent more locations across the field because it's wrapping up. You're getting more layers, and you're sampling more, more layers in that hay and getting a good representative sample. If you do it on the flat side, that may only represent, just one or two locations. So, grab samples are better than nothing, but it's all about sampling. And you're trying to make an economic decision off a sample. So sampling technique is important when it comes to hay sampling. I get quite a few questions about nutrient requirements or ration balancing. I stole this from Walton Stewart. He's the nutritionist, extension nutritionist, beef cattle nutritionist up in Athens. And this is a good diagram looking at brood cow nutrient requirements over the year. So on the y-axis over there is daily requirements, representing crude protein or TDN, which is energy. And on the bottom there, it shows you 0 to basically a year, days post calving. So you got calving, breeding, weaning, and calving again. And during that year, you're going to go through lactation and also gestation. If you look at a cow that's in peak lactation, your crude protein requirements are going to be 12%, and you're going to have a 60% TDN or energy requirement. So if you're in a drought running short on hay, grouping these cows based off nutrition requirements will be advantageous for you because dry cows, if you have lower quality hay, you can satisfy the nutrient requirements of dry cows, which, in the ballpark, you're looking at 7% protein and 48% TDN. So grouping cows is a good way to hopefully, make these hay supplies stretch. If you have bad quality hay, if you have good quality hay, you can allocate that to lactating cows. So, group them, please. If you're running low on hay supplies. We have something called relative forage quality, but this is the typical range of quality of common forages, which is a way to compare what their feed quality is among, different forages. For example, small grain at the top, the RFQ can range from, 80 to 70. So if you look at some of our Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, it's lower RFQ compared to some of these winter annuals, such as small grain ryegrass, peanut hays down there. So it's just a good way to compare different forages based off the class of animal that you have. And RFQ, I think, is based off dry matter intake and also some other quality factors there too. So all UGA samples that are run in will have an RFQ thing at the top of it. And here's an example forage and feed analysis. This is near infrared reflectant or in our analysis. So here we're talking about relative feed quality. So that's a good way to compare forage types for a specific livestock class. For this example here, you have a lactating beef cow, and this particular forage is a 65 RFQ, which is not good. So when I look at this, I see a 65 RFQ. I see a dry matter intake of 1.75. So based off the lignin and some of these other quality factors, that lactating cow is expected to eat up 1.75% of its body weight. So better quality is probably going to eat more. So that RFQ and dry matter intake does take into consideration the forage quality. So if you come into the county agent's office or you come in my office and say, Jeremy, I got this feed analysis or this forage analysis, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at TDN, which is the energy, and you can use that to balance a ration. Also, too, we look at crude fiber, and to calculate the dry matter intake and digestibility, people look at the NDF, ADF, and lignin. We usually look at dry matter basis. Hey, this particular example, the moisture is 25%, so it's probably smelling a little musky, a little moldy. We like to be, 15% or so, so it's a little wet. But those are some of the things that we look at here at a feed and forage analysis. Nitrates is another thing we have to worry about during drought. You think about nitrate accumulators like summer annuals or just drought stressed annuals, period. Nitrate accumulate, because of over-fertilization or moisture stress that we have. So if you got nitrates on a dry matter basis less than 4,500, then it's safe to feed. So this table here I use quite a bit. Nitrates is one of those things that we have to have in the back of our mind. When we're coming out of a drought, we try to feed these cows. We need to look at body conditioning scoring. You need help, looking at your herd. Basically, that's assessing the energy reserve status of the cow. It's a 1 to 9 scale. I think in the Master Cattleman series, if you're interested in that, call your extension agent. But they go through body conditioning scoring just to see what type of status these cows are in. because it can impact how these cows rebreed. So in this particular slide here, we got a cow at the top that's a body condition score of 4, and one at the bottom is a 5. So if you look at body condition score compared to pregnancy rate, if you have a 4, which is illustrated here at the top, you're looking at maybe 60%, breeding back. But if you bump it up to a body condition score of 5, then that significantly increases the pregnancy rate or rebreeding these cows back. All right, so we got our forage sample back. We grouped our cows. So let's say we can get a 50-50 mix of corn, gluten feed, and soy hulls, which is pretty common. How much can we feed? To find that out, one tool that I use is the basic balancer. It's a spreadsheet. I think you use a Pearson square to balance rations, which is an old way of doing it. It's a simple way of doing it, but you can download this off the web. It's a good tool. If you sit down and figure it out, you can do a lot of things. You can price feeds, you can price rations based off pound per, crude protein or pound per energy, because cow prices are going down a little bit. We got to feed these cows the most economical way we can. So if you need some help with this basic balancer program, call your county agent. They'll be happy to do it. We can get Lawton Stewart on the phone. But if we use your basic balancer and we have a dry pregnant cow, which requires a 7% protein, 48% TDN, the poor quality forage, which is listed at the top, poor quality forage is classified as 7% protein, 48% TDN. That poor quality forage can satisfy the nutritional needs for that dry pregnant cow. Now, what about a peak, cow that's in peak lactation that has 12% protein or 60% TDN? We're going to have to use some supplementation there. So we would probably, if we had excellent forage, which is classified as 13% protein or 56%, TDN, we'd have to feed about 6 pounds of that that supplement. But if we had bad quality forage or poor quality forage and fed it to that higher that group of cows that have a higher nutrition requirement, we would have to feed another 10 pounds. So, this is just a good way to figure out, hey, how much do I supplement? What type of forage I have? And, how that can impact. Knowing those basic features there, using, just a basic ration balancing program, you can impact your bottom line by, figuring out where to feed it and how to feed it. Here's some basic rations that you can free choice to a lactating cow. We use a lot of whole cottonseed down here. We use a lot of gin trash for beef cattle. So these are just some basic rations that you could use, to get a good simple ration. You may want to put in some Bovatec or Rumensin and put in some minerals too. But this is actually, I can get you this information. I think it's in the hay replacement publication that we have on the web. So these are some rations here, for dry pregnant cows. So these are I use this table all the time. Good stuff. All right, so considerations for early weaning. Some people trying to wean or utilizing that early weaning technique to try to get through the drought that we have with the stretched, hay supplies. So you think about a dry cow will require 30 to 40% less energy to feed than a lactating cow. Culling rate, if you look at budgets and other type of management techniques, 15 to 20% is probably a normal rate every year. So if we can reduce herds, culling, with early weaning too, can cut feed, for these other cows, at least by half also. Low producing dry pastures may be enough to maintain dry cows that have been weaned, but maintaining cow-calf pairs on dry pasture will result in low calf growth weights and lower body condition scores, maybe in the spring. So that goes back to some of that body conditioning score tips that we said at the beginning, during this presentation too. So early weaning calves are extremely efficient. So, if we can develop if you want to carry on some of these calves. They're pretty efficient in using feed. So, they may, depending on what you use, 4 to 5 pounds of feed per pound of gain with a high quality diet is another thing to think about. If we try to, hold these calves a little bit longer, and, we need to have 70% or greater TDN and 18% protein. So that's some of the nutrition requirements for some of these calves that, you're trying to put, 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a day on. All right. I get a lot of questions on, range cubes and stuff. Very convenient. Don't really need troughs, but feeding 3 to 5 pounds a day is usually recommended. I get a lot of questions about liquid supplements. Sometimes these feed tubs, protein tubs, they can be expensive. They're very convenient, but usually the consumption is 1 to 2 pounds a day. So just kind of figure out, how much protein and energy are in these liquid tubs. So, self-feeding, some people want to, put out, hot rations and stuff like that. You can limit the supplementation, by using salt. Had that question this week too. Also, try to figure out some of the byproducts in your area, in your particular area. We got a lot of people, fencing in cotton fields right now, trying to get so cotton fields, crop residues, if you got them, that would be a way to cut down on, some of the hay supply. We use a lot of cottonseed because we got a lot of cotton gins around, but, just look around to see what type of byproduct feeds that you can buy economically. If you're a smaller grower, sometimes that can be a challenge because the amount that you can handle, but, we got to think about every way that we can reduce, hay feeding and stuff like that. So anyway, I think that's it. Any questions?
This is James Ford. You talk about that peanut hay and the wrapping it tightly, I guess wrapping it. What's the
B-wrap?
Yeah, B-wrap. And most of the guys down my way, they just bale the peanut hay and you kind of leave it in the field and stack it. What's the I guess I said the cost benefit of wrapping it versus just baling and leaving it in the field? Is it any economics in that?
So if it's a dry fall or dry winter, you probably wouldn't have the dry matter losses. But in a wet winter or wet, if it's stacked outside, we've seen some of the information here in this presentation showing that, if you had, 3-4% or 3-4 inch weathering around that bale, it'll pay for itself pretty quickly.
Okay.
I don't know if any research has been done on it, but we got some peanut vine hay last year, and some of it came from a producer who sold to a cattle guy who requested that it be wrapped with plastic wrap. So just one roll of plastic wrap. So not like baleage or silage, but just one roll of plastic wrap. And it was so green and pretty up underneath there. But I couldn't help but notice that the quality was better, and I'm sure the yield was probably better as well, as far as less spoilage. And that's not commonly done. And like I said, I don't know if any research has been done on how cost effective it is, but Jeremy had that slide where he showed that even just net wrap versus twine helps reduce the loss, and that covering with a tarp helps reduce losses, even if you leave it outside. So it's kind of like not everybody can build a barn. Not everybody may be able to afford that B-wrap, which is different from just regular net wrapping, but you kind of just do what you can to avoid losing hay so you get more of it into your cows. There are some hay feeders that you can build. And so if you're handy and have scrap lumber, you may be able to build some type of cradle hay feeder for cows, or especially for sheep and goats. If anybody got sheep or goats, you can take a cattle wire panel and hang it in between 4 posts and make a cradle feeder that sheep and goats can eat out of, or you can wrap a bale with sheep or goat wire and panels, the welded wire panels, and make hay feeders. So it's much easier for sheep and goats than it is for cows. But you could try to make your own if you can't afford the hay rings, I guess is what I'm saying. But just trying to find ways to really stretch that hay by reducing your losses any way that you can be good.
I've seen more people, wrap it up in that basically, the silage wrap. They may do 2 or 3 wraps per bale, but you got to think about it requires a pretty big footprint because you can't really stack it up, but it does. I've seen more people utilize that wrapper. So the more tons of hay that you run through that wrapper, the cheaper it is, from an equipment economic standpoint. But I've seen more people doing that. It's just purchasing the wrapper.
A lot of us are buying hay, so making sure that if you can test it before you buy it, that will be good. If you can't, even just realizing if you can look at it, and there's just some basic things to look at, like stem length. So even how long and how thick are the stems can tell you that that person may have harvested for yield versus quality. And if it's real thick and stemmy, then the quality is probably lower. So just making sure that if you can't test it, that you use some of the guidelines for looking at hay that was cut and baled properly is also good. There was and Jeremy gave examples of feed supplements that you can give, because if you need to, not just based on the quality of the hay, so even if you don't test, but the amount of hay. So one of those drought publications was saying that using a feed supplement to replace some of the hay, because you may not be able to get enough hay. So you may have to ration out that hay. So in order to meet the animals' nutritional requirements, you may have to add a feed or grain supplement. And there were some examples in there. This one is showing your tested forages and how much to supplement. But what I was also looking at is if you have to limit hay. So even if it's excellent, if you have to limit it, then these numbers may be different. So a dry pregnant cow, even with poor forage, if you're limiting that poor forage, you're going to have to supplement. This is based on free choice hay.
Yes.
And so we may not be able to give free choice hay because we may be very limited in the amount of hay that we can find. And if that's the case, just realize that you may need to provide an alternative feed. You gave some examples of some rations, like these. It gives examples of some rations that you can mix. And especially like those peanut hulls, cottonseed hulls, gin trash, it says or hay. But if you're limited in the hay, you can try these higher fiber feedstuffs that you can add in there that can help replace some of the hay. So if you're able to do that, and even if we were talking, you may just be able to get whole cottonseed and put that out, because it depends on what you can find. But looking at alternatives to hay, if you're going to have to ration that hay, just realize that you still want to try to meet the requirements of the animal, so they don't get so thin that they get sick and die easy, those kind of things. Basically, you want to keep them alive and productive. If they get so thin that they can't fight off disease, they can't make it through the cold weather, then you kind of get in trouble. Any other questions?
Yes, my name is Sabrina from Roe Edwards Farm, and I just have 2 questions. Number one is, we were using the ring, and then we stopped because when the cows use the ring, it ends up being a mushy mess right there. What can you do to prevent that from happening for us to continue to use the ring? Because I see now that we're losing a lot of hay due to the fact that we're doing that. Question number 2 is, we have a pole barn, but we don't have sides on the pole barn. But do you think are we really taking that big of a hit by there not being any sides on that barn?
I think the pole barn, it would reduce, hay matter, dry matter losses significantly, I think. So, I see a lot of barns without sides on them. So I think it's I think it's the just the continuous exposure to the elements that get us. So putting it underneath the barn would reduce it quite a bit. On the hay ring, some people move it around. So, some people may have a sacrificed area, but if you move it around a little bit, the hay ring, then, that should be able to mitigate some of this pasture damage that you're seeing.
Yeah, and I don't know if NRCS will pay for heavy use areas for those feeding areas as well, but yeah, you can have sacrifice lots, and which means just that nothing's gonna grow up in there, and it's just gonna be some muddy area. Or you can, like Jeremy said, move it around. You'll need to get rid of that and level out those areas, get rid of that hay, because the leftover hay, the waste hay that they leave in there, is a breeding ground for flies, so it can make your fly problem a lot worse if you leave a bunch of hay around in the early spring. But getting rid of that. I also recommend, and some people feel like they lose more hay, but I do recommend taking off the hay net and taking off your bale string, because they can eat it and die. And especially if you're limiting their hay, if you have to limit their hay, they're more likely to try to eat every little piece, which means that they could be eating the bale string or hay net. It can make them bloat and die, or it can give them blockages where they can't move food through and they can die. And so that's not ideal. Plus, if you have all that string or net out in your field and you're trying to mow, it gets caught up in your equipment and stuff like that. And I know some people say they just kind of dig it up and bury that area so that they don't have to deal with that. But it can be an issue, especially when you're, like I said, when you're trying to feed them. So thinking about that as well. I don't know if that helps or not. But another thing about feeding hay that I've seen people try to drop bales into a ring instead of lifting the ring up and putting the bale down and then putting the ring over it. So if you just keep piling hay on top of old hay in the same spot, that makes it really messy around it. Also, if you end up where you have to limit hay and you make them eat as much as they can, like my uncle will say, I just want them to clean it up. Well, the problem with that is, especially before it freezes, right? You can still have a worm problem. So they're going to stand in it, they're going to poop on it. And then if you try to make them eat as much of it as they can around those feeders, it's going to be it's going to be not good for them that they try to eat that. So those are some things to think about when you're feeding hay as well.
I have a question about gin trash. In my mind, gin trash may not be the best thing to eat. Now, that's in my mind, and that's on it. But from the standpoint of maybe some residues from the crop or whatnot. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it goes back to pre-harvest intervals. Like if you think about peanut hay, for example, a lot of peanuts are a smaller crop in the whole grand scheme of things. So a lot of the stuff that we spray on peanuts probably isn't labeled for it. Now I think they've done some work with gin trash and also cottonseed, when it comes to like MSMA or diuron or something like that. I don't think there's a big problem with that. I think I've seen some research with some of these defoliants like DEF or Folex, so there might be a little bit of that. But, we feed more cottonseed than we do gin trash. So if we follow the pre-harvest intervals, then, we should be okay.
Yeah, and the gin trash is really more of a fiber source. And so that's why it's grouped in there with peanut hulls, cottonseed hulls, gin trash, and hay. So it's a fiber source. Hay, you would hope, would be more nutritious than those others. Peanut hulls and gin trash are fairly low nutrient, high fiber sources. And so that's why we look at it more of a replacement for a fiber in hay. And a cheaper replacement because they should be fairly inexpensive.
This is Carolyn. I have a quick question. And you noted earlier about how some farmers are allowing the cows to go into cotton fields. Is there a period of time or a wait time after the cotton is produced, or are there any chemicals that are sprayed that we need to be wary of before roping off a cotton field once they've harvested the cotton?
Okay. No, because when you run out of hay or before the grazing gets going, oftentimes we fence it off and let the cows in because it's a good, they're eating the cottonseed, so there shouldn't be that big of a wait. No, ma'am.
What about the cotton itself? It isn't doing the damage or compact them?
Johnny Rossi and some of these other folks about 10, 12 years ago did some work with, grazing cotton stalks, and a lot of people do it. So, they're after the cottonseed. That's what they're after. So I hadn't really heard any issues, with the fiber.
Fiber breaks down. I mean, the cotton fibers themselves, they break down. And I graze the cotton fields after they've harvested it personally with my animals, and haven't ever had a problem with stopping them up or anything like that. So, and they will just eat the whole cotton boll. They'll eat it right off what's left of the stems and stuff. They'll graze the annual weeds that are coming up around it. And if you overseed, which could be done too, overseeds, spread annual grass in there, they could be grazing that as well if it comes up, if you're able to, before they get in there and cut it, because they're supposed to mow it, but the people around me will let me graze the cotton fields before they mow it. But yeah, my cows love it.
But if you're in drought and need to feed cows, then you got to do what you got to do.
And if you're worried about whatever they spray, there are some guidelines I think out there that say after they've harvested or after they've sprayed, but it's usually if they spray a defoliant, it's usually a while after. There's a good period between when they spray and when they harvest that, it's kind of like a withdrawal time, if you will. But I think there are some guidelines out there. I've seen it. I looked it up too because I was the same way asking those questions. Looked it up and I felt like it was okay for my animals.
I had many of those same questions that we were just discussing, and I stumbled across a publication by UGA. It's called Considerations When Feeding Byproducts. That publication, I think, was about 8 or 9 pages and answered a lot of the questions that I had regarding feeding cottonseed and gin trash and some of those other items. So you may find that beneficial also for the group.
Okay. Another thing, cottonseed, we didn't really dwell on cottonseed much, but I've had some questions about cottonseed. There are some recommendations on limitations for cottonseed, and those limitations are based on gossypol in the cotton. And I will say that a lot of the cotton varieties in the southeast are low gossypol varieties. So I do know some cattle producers who are, using more whole cotton seed. In general, we say just in case for the gossypol, not to feed it to non-ruminating calves. So calves before they're about 4 months old, really rather have them have it wean calves. You could feed it, but and they say not to feed it to developing bulls or bulls that you're gonna breed because of the gossypol.
I have heard this is old studies back in the day, where over 5 pounds per head per day cause some harm to breeding bulls' fertility, the sperm count. So I think it's not just feeding it; it's how much you get in that ration. So I think I heard like before when they're not ruminants. So calves less than 3 or 4 months of age, don't put it in the creek feed. And for the mature bulls, for sure, I think. Yeah.
And so again, it's rather, if you want to be better safe than sorry kind of thing.
Great information. Now, with your calving, now the question that I'm asking is just on what you just left off of. Now, you're saying not to give any of your calves even cottonseed within the first 4 to 5 months?
To be safe, right? Because it's an anti-nutritional factor, so it'll reduce their growth, and I'm not sure how much they'd have to eat to actually, cause any death losses, but it definitely will reduce their growth and reduce your weaning weights if you give high levels of whole cottonseed in young calves' diets.
Yeah, I was just asking because I normally, like I said, like to keep my calves with, let them wean or be around the mothers for the first 6 months anyway.
If you have a controlled breeding season, as long as they're at least 4 months old, they'll have they should have a functioning rumen 4 months old. So if your calves are at least 4 months old, you can go ahead and feed cows and calves together. Yeah. Well, you don't have to remove them. You can feed them the cottonseed with their mamas as long as they're at least 4 months old.
I got you.
But if you do, like Jeremy mentioned this, early weaning, so that's a way to stretch your hay supplies is wean them and sell them early, because then you don't have to feed the mama as much, and then you don't have them to feed. So if you need to stretch your feed or hay supplies, culling the cows that you already need to cull, and early weaning calves can really help stretch the hay that you have and help it be more affordable to feed. And we've talked about this in the past of how it is almost the exact same cost to feed a good cow as it is to feed a bad cow. And so, right. So getting rid of those bad cows that give you puny babies, or hardly, that may not even give you a calf every year, so making sure you're keeping records so you know who's productive, getting rid of those cows, that again, they're eating the same amount of hay, as the others, but they're not giving you the same amount of calf back out of those. So get rid of those so it saves you money on your hay bill, on your feed bill. And Dr. Noble's always told us, watch the size of your cow, the frame score of the cow. So a tall, framey cow is going to eat more than a smaller frame cow. So we usually say, Dr. Noble, 4s and 5s for your cows, frame score, right? And then use about a 6 frame score for your bull on those cows. But so the bigger the cow, the more they're going to eat. So keep that in mind as well.
I think another concern I've heard before with farmers is normally when a cow is pregnant, the baby inside of her is probably growing the fastest the last 3 months. So if you give that mother a high protein diet, you make him build a lot of muscle on that calf that you may not want. So excess of protein in the diet of a late pregnant cow it's probably more concerned with charolais and simmentals, but you can increase that birth weight because the protein in that diet can make the calf kind of metabolize a little bit quicker.
And then you'll run into, and not to cut you off, but then you'll run into like having stress on birthing and calving.
Yeah, with big calves, yeah.
Yeah, but you also want to realize that those last 3 months, those calves are growing really, really fast. And so if you don't, especially if you're trying to stretch your hay, you want to make sure that your cows don't get in poor body condition before they calve, because then they won't have the nutritional stores to lactate, to produce the milk to feed the baby. So just watch those body condition scores. You don't want them to get too fat. You don't want to get huge calves because you don't want to overfeed them so that they get good, big, huge calves. But you don't want them to get in poor body condition, and then not have the energy reserves to make the milk that the babies need.
What do you all think about from the, I guess, spring months for sunflower? Because I've viewed a lot of people and talked to a couple of people. They said they're supplementing sunflowers now.
I've heard of sunflower seeds, and I've seen some people planting sunflower. Jeremy, do you know anything about it?
That's a new one on me.
Yeah, black oil sunflower seeds are real popular with some of the show people, especially for sheep and goats. But it's fairly expensive. But I think I have seen, like you said, they're planting them in forage. But I don't know much about the nutritional content. Yeah, I think it would be kind of expensive, though. It seems like it would be. I don't know.
Yes, I was actually thinking about that and checking on that also. So it is kind of pricey, but I just didn't know if anybody else had dealt with that type of situation.
All right. If there's no more questions, thank you, Jeremy, for coming, and thank everybody for attending. And we really appreciate you participating. Jeremy, we appreciate you giving us this valuable information and helping our producers to hopefully be able to stretch their hay supplies through this winter. Hopefully we'll get some rain and we'll get some more grazing, some winter grazing. That helps a lot too.